are in Hanoi on Train Street. On Train Street, you can see that we have mixed use of cafes, restaurants, and then also an active train railroad track. Today, we're going to talk about land use in cities. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. As we continue our discussion of cities, today we're going to talk about topic 6.6, which is density and land use. Residential buildings and patterns of land use reflect and shape the city's culture, technological capacities, cycles of development, and infilling, which are all things we're going to talk about today. Understanding residential density helps us to understand how our space is shaped around us. Most of us are very familiar with one type of this density and not the others. So we're going to go through the three types of density to understand the way that suburbs and cities look. The first is low density housing. Many of you are familiar with this concept. These are residential areas with single family homes and a small number of units. Good examples of this are subdivisions in Milton with large plots of land. So this would be an example of low density housing. Everyone has very large yards, the houses are far apart from each other, and everyone has their own driveway and parking space. These suburbs are extremely common outside of big cities all across America. This is medium density housing. Medium density houses don't always have to be attached. Sometimes you have semi-attached homes or low-rise apartments that fit on less land. Good examples of this would be townhomes or narrow plots of land. 2- and 3-story apartments or condos all fit into medium density housing. So residential areas where we see more houses put on space, but not necessarily tightly packed apartments. High density housing are residential areas with attached or stacked homes packed into a small area. So high-rise apartments in cities are a good example of high-density housing. All three of these types of housings have their positives and negatives, and we're going to go through each and look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of each type of housing. Low-density housing, which is around the school that I teach at, provide individuals a lot of land and yard. It gives you more privacy, and space is less expensive out in the suburbs so that you can have land to let your kids play on or let dogs out or just to have some space between your neighbors. The negatives are that services are spread too thin to be effective. So you can't have public transportation out in the suburbs that's really effective because it doesn't make sense to install a rail for when so many people own their own cars and spread out. It also creates an issue where people are not a part of a walking community or services. So out in neighborhoods, there aren't restaurants or shops that people can go to and gather at. People are typically pretty isolated or have to drive to go find those services. Everyone driving creates more pollution and traffic as people try to commute to work, which brings up everybody's commute times. It also creates segregation based on class, because you have to have a certain amount of money to own your own land out in spaces like this. So the schools and areas in that are typically segregated by social class because people are not able to afford those things. And like I said, it's too spread out for public transit, so people are unable to be connected. Medium density housing offers benefits of better communication and connection to urban and community areas. It allows for more public transit and makes walking more viable. We see less pollution because of this. We also see mixed land use, where you have residential mixed with other things. So a good example of medium density housing, if you're thinking of Cambridge High School, would be the neighborhood across the street that has the houses that are fairly near each other. They are not connected. Everyone has their own home, but they are taking up less space, and they create a walkable environment where people can walk to the high school or over to Starbucks and Publix to get the things that they need. Some of the negatives are that they can create expensive areas that price out mixed social groups. Downtown Alpharetta is a good example of this, where it is an awesome area with everything you could need, but the price point to get in is very high for people with not high-class jobs. So only really people who make over a certain amount of money each year could ever think to live in those areas. And it's got a blend of both positives and negatives of the other two. High density housing has its benefits. Shorter commute times to work. Often people live within walking distance of their job, or at least can jump on a commuter train to get to it. It gives you access to walkable areas. It gives more entertainment options in nightlife, more restaurants and culture. And they're built in urban areas that slow or stop sprawl. So we don't see this takeover of green spaces and farmland when you have high density housing. The negatives are you have a lot of people competing for services. It can become overcrowded, and you don't have as much privacy. Sometimes it also isolates people from their neighbors and resources as you build up and up and up. We also see situations arise in inner cities where people don't have access to grocery stores and things like that, and food deserts because of high density housing. So it's important to weigh the positives and negatives of each when we think about zoning practices to make this a reality. One way to combat sprawl, that urban sprawl that takes over our green spaces and farmland, is that instead of sprawling further out from the city, you try to fill in the gaps. This is called infill. So infill is trying to add housing and services to make the city more livable after building up in that area. So finding the empty spaces or the abandoned spaces and transforming them into more livable spaces for people. This is an example where they built over the light rail commuter train and they made a station around it with housing above and residential shopping and restaurants all around. So filling in these gaps where there weren't buildings in order to build denser where there's already sprawl. Here's a cartoon of them building higher density housing in a developed area in order to infill and use our space better. Infilling is a great way to try to create less urban sprawl and build up things that are better. An example of this too would be the expansion of downtown Alpharetta, where they built higher density housing in order to accommodate more people and create a livable, walkable area rather than spreading out further from the city. So in 6.6, we talked about how urban land use can be determined by how dense the housing is and the benefits and negatives of each of those. Remember that the suburbs and the spread creates more pollution and traffic but gives people more space, where super high density housing can isolate people or give them lack of access to resources. We'll continue to think about these challenges as we look at our next few topics in human geography, but learning about the density of housing gives us one more step into better understanding our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography.